listening to the various discussions we've had today, and so I'd like to put into context the topic of my presentation, the systematic explicit approach. So I'm focusing on literacy, but much of what we've listened to today has been related to evidence-based practice, and so the context I would like to deliver is that topic within the concept of evidence-based practice. A couple of things. First, these overheads, I believe, will be available on the website, so you shouldn't need to take voluminous notes. And secondly, the material on which this topic derives is available on the web. If you did a Google search for Nifty, N-I-F-D-I, and Hempenstall, you'll find a sort of a blog I do which consists of many different reviews of educational research topics to do with literacy. So older readers, so phonemic awareness, mental health and literacy. Over the years I've reviewed a lot of those topics. So if there's material here that we don't cover that is of interest, then feel free to look at that. The issue of evidence-based practice, we hear a lot about it. We've heard the notion that in other fields evidence-based practice has become the norm. And we've heard about medicine, and I should put in a plug for my own profession, psychology, which in the 90s, about the same time, believe it or not, that medicine was addressing the topic of evidence-based practice as being the prime determinant of the way a doctor acts. One had always thought that wasn't medicine always evidence-based, and it turned out no. And there are still huge problems, particularly with the old farts, people of my generation who were trained a long time ago and whose practice, even in medicine and in psychology, is driven more by the way they were trained and their subsequent personal experience, not by things like the Cochrane collection in medicine, not by much of the research into clinical psychology that's taken place since the 90s. So when we talk about evidence-based practice in education, and as we see here in the National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy, it may take a long time before the understanding that evidence-based practice can be really beneficial. It may take a long time before it actually has an impact in education, just as it has in medicine and in clinical psychology. Why would we be interested in evidence-based practice? We're teachers, we're trained, we have a wonderful understanding of the uniqueness of every child, and we do our best to meet their needs. But one of the things that as teachers we've all been used to is these rapid changing fads in education. And one of the criticisms of the systems of education in Australia has been these fads are rarely evaluated. Criticism from the I think it was the Nous group in 2011, from other groups, that education systems have been loath to evaluate. They've been quick to change, they've been driven by fads and ideology in the past. And so we need to move towards a stage where we can reduce these swings if we have a standard set of protocols for determining what actually works. So acceptance of research evidence becomes one of the difficult criteria for a profession to move into an evidence-based format. We see it in a number of other areas. I mentioned medicine and psychology, but if you look at the way agriculture is going, the way transport goes, those have accepted evidence-based practice because the results are very clear and they are clearly evident quite rapidly. One of our difficulties in education is that the practices that we would put into place with an evidence base will not necessarily be immediately evident. So there are additional hurdles we have. Educational policymakers, as we heard from Stephen Dinham, until recent times, educational policymakers have paid almost no attention to research. Those policymakers do not typically have a science background, a mathematics background. Research design is not something that they have tended to be familiar with. And so policy developers have tended to be influenced by other areas rather than of research knowledge. Teacher education programs, we've seen recently a national body examining teacher education programs. That's been done over a number of years, and it's not the first report on some of the problems with teacher education that we have. Partly that's been, I think, ideological in teacher training institutions, that again, there hasn't been a science base, that people who work in education faculties tend to have a different perspective on the value of research than the one that we're now beginning to see promoted in various policy documents. We're not yet seeing it at the coalface, except in some wondrous examples, but generally speaking across the system, we would not say we are an evidence-based profession. So there are still challenges there. How long might it take? We'll see. Research, if we are attempting to convince teachers that it's worth adopting a sense that research may have something to offer, then one way to do that is to talk about the sorts of topics that research might aid. So here are some of the questions that research can help with and has been addressing. Reading approaches, are they equally effective? Depends partly on your sense of judgment about whether reading approaches are what determines a child's outcome. Some people believe that for example, that a child's progress is intrinsically determined and not by something that a teacher does. Should we be worried about children whose progress is not very good in the early stages? Should we wait for maturity to catch up? Or should we look at the research and see whether we should be intervening early and intensively as necessary? Disadvantaged students, can teaching alter the trajectory if we believe that students' progress is determined by a natural developmental sequence rather than by instruction? Then we would have a different outcome. Social promotion or retention, what are the pros and cons of both of those? These are issues that are struggled with by schools every day. Smaller class sizes make a difference. Spend a few hundreds of millions of dollars to drop your class size from 28 to 25. Do you think it makes a difference? The research has something to say about that. So, does it mean you give up all you have as a teacher and you become an evidence-based practitioner, or as some have described it, a scientist practitioner? It's actually about incorporating the best empirical evidence along with those components of teaching that you might call those of an artisan, those aspects of instruction that are part of your armoury in any case. It's about the two of those things coming together. The main reason we need to do this is, regardless of how we do in international assessments and national assessments, we have students who really struggle. We have too many students who really struggle, and we need to do something about that. If we depend on teachers because of their training, their personal talents, their personality, if that's all we depend on, then we are forgetting there's a big elephant in the room, and that's teacher variability. We all know, working in schools, that teachers are not all equally effective. There is a way, however, by using protocols, by introducing evidence-based practice, there was a way to reduce the variability that takes place in classrooms. Reduce that inconsistency across teachers, the ones that have an impact in our own school, but across the system can be disastrous for students who struggle. There is pressure for reform. I'm not sure that real reform is going to take place in the short term, but in the longer term I am optimistic that that will be so. But where is this pressure coming from? Well, until we had NAPLAN, the national testing, and then access to international testing as well, we really didn't have too much idea of how our students in Australia were doing. We may have had some state testing prior to that, but there was this sense that, well, is testing really telling us anything? We had our teacher organisation saying, get out of our space. We know children. We see them every day. We know how they're doing. We don't need state, national and international assessment. Nevertheless, we have it. And the data that we are obtaining from that, and that plan is by no means a perfect instrument, but it's the first one that's given us national data. And it is raising pressure for change in our education system. Government budgetary vigilance, I guess we're all used to that, and that seems to be increasingly a vigilant approach. As monies are drawn out of our national budget in a range of areas, it includes education as well. So the Commonwealth Government and the state governments too are very interested in how every dollar is spent, and hence evaluation of programs becomes much more important and much more likely to occur. The long-term economic and social effects are becoming clearer. That is, what happens to our society when we have, as the Australian Bureau of Statistics noted a few years ago, almost 50% of Australian adults from 15 to 74 performing below the minimum level for being able to contribute successfully to our society. Those are dramatic figures, and they are part of the pressure for change. How might this reform occur? How might it appear and be continued on? We can only look at other countries, and in Great Britain we see, particularly in the area of literacy, we see quite clear mandating of what a curriculum will consist of. Or in the USA, when the federal government began to take a role in education in the US, which prior to that was primarily a local issue, locally funded, the way the US government looked at it was to say, we will give you extra money if as a consequence of the money you introduce evidence-based practices. Now, there were all sorts of issues with that, and it hasn't been an enormous success. A great deal of resistance to the feds taking over, and you had, almost expecting an armed revolution from the locals. However, there have been important reports that have preceded significant reform. So in Great Britain, the primary national strategy followed on from the Rose Report, and the primary national strategy determines curriculum in literacy and beyond, but I'm interested mostly in literacy, following that Rose Report. In the USA, the significant legislative change came after the report of the National Reading Panel in 2000. In Australia, the biggest inquiry that we've had yet is the National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy. It used the term evidence-based practice 48 times. It shows you how sometimes I waste time scanning documents, counting 48 times. And it's been certainly the most significant report. As Kevin mentioned earlier today, we haven't seen any change It's yet to be formally adopted and acted upon. The government review of funding for schools in 2011 also indicated that we should be paying more attention to evidence-based practice, but we're not as yet. And again, the report there came via the Nous group. So will policy reform occur here, and will it take place at the classroom level? I'm not sure. I hope so. But I think it's still not quite clear. Just because we have buzzwords in policy documents doesn't mean we have action at the coalface. The new group that has been mentioned a couple of times, the new report of the Teacher Education Ministerial Advisory Group. I think it was published just last week, and I haven't had a good chance to go through it in detail yet. However, it does indicate that teacher education programs, which in the past have had a very poor record of training teachers in how to teach literacy, are going to be expected to change their mode of teaching in the training of pre-service teachers to incorporate evidence bases. Now, how that's going to take place, I'm not too sure. Many teacher educators have been in their positions for many years, going right back to the whole language days of the 80s, and seeing them adopt an approach that has been anathema to them. I'm not too sure. I suspect it's going to take some time and natural attrition before we start to see teacher educators who are trained in being able to read research, to interpret research, but B, to value research. I'm happy, by the way, to answer questions anytime.
I've got a question about that one specifically. And there's one element of the research that's actually the research into teaching practices in schools, but then another element of research into teaching practices in university teacher training courses.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's a pretty solid evidence base at the first level, but perhaps not as solid an evidence base at the second level. And at least within Australia, it seems like not a ton of interest in that second kind of research yet. Can you speak to that at all?
Only to agree with you that teacher training institutions haven't been hotbeds of innovation and research in the past. And it's partly because of that systemic teacher education problem that we have a systemic student progress problem. So the two are clearly linked. Whether this report will just go the way of so many other reports, I really don't know. But it's a very important area.
Did you say evidence-based research is anathema in teaching teachers?
Yeah. That's
Strong
speaking. Well, it is a strong word, but it's been made clear in research in Australia over many years. Those of us who've worked in the area of evidence-based practice and have had experience in teacher education faculties, those have been the information that we gather. When we read the work that is published by teacher education staff, those are the impacts that they have. Now, I've been out for a couple of years now. I would hope that things are changing either because attitudes are changing or because the staff are changing. Why haven't we adopted evidence-based practice? Isn't it so obvious that we do need to be taking account of a parallel universe that can inform us and benefit us in the practices that we use with the children who are in our care? It just seems so obvious, yet it has not been part of our system, neither from policymakers nor from teachers. The National Inquiry had something to say about that. that research emphasis has not been part of teacher training. Now that's 10 years old. One might hope that things have changed since then, but I don't see evidence of it. And when I talk to teachers, I used to run a course for teachers at RMIT for the education faculty students who would take an elective. And when I would ask them, what do you know about phonemic awareness? What do you know about classroom management? Nothing. What do you know about phonics? Well, we know it's no good. So these are just students from a couple of years ago. So I think, you know, it's hard to say whether this is representative of every university education faculty, and I know of a couple such as Melbourne University and Edith Cowan University in Western Australia who are doing some terrific work with teacher education. But if you look at or read the National Inquiry into the Teaching of Literacy, you see that there's very little emphasis on literacy in teacher education. Some of the faculties had less than 5% of their courses devoted to it. So you know, there really is a great deal of need for change to take place there. One of the things I asked the rhetorical question, why haven't we absorbed this evidence? Why do we not take it up and make it part of our armoury for addressing the problems of student progress? Some of them I mentioned as a belief in individual student progress being governed by things other than the education system, governed more by SES, by personal developmental sequences that are unique to the individual. We've seen those sorts of explanations before. These are some of the writings of individuals who have made claims about what determines the progress of students. They turn out not to be correct, but nevertheless these are claims that have had an influence over the years. Jenks, of course, Christopher Jenks was famous for his comments back in 1972. He recanted those beliefs during the early 2000s about the potential for teaching to have a vast impact on student progress and the trajectory of student progress. The whole language people had quite a bit to say in the 80s and 90s that deflected us from instruction as a potentially crucial variable. So knowledge is best discovered, not taught. We still see that concept held, that in some way knowledge derived from one's own personal investigations is superior to knowledge that one has acquired through the teaching of another. It turns out that knowledge is knowledge, and how it is derived doesn't seem to make a difference in the quality and the way in which we can use that knowledge. I should add too that nearly all of my career I've been involved with students who struggle. So much of what I say is to do with what happens to students who are vulnerable when they are provided with less than optimal instruction. We have to get it right with that group. For the kids who learn off the smell of an oily curriculum, you know, most of them get there. They may not reach their full potential, but most will do well enough to think, well, okay, we've done our job. But for the vulnerable students, no. The other relationships, we must have a personal relationship with the student so they will become engaged, enthused, and again, discover their own learning. That's not to say relationships are not important and that engagement's not important, but not as the causal link between curriculum and learning. And we've already heard enough about learning style shortly. Some more, learning to read is as natural as learning to speak. It's the reason why one might have accepted the whole language approach, that we only need to read to kids And because they have an internal trajectory, they learn to speak without having to have formal education. Therefore, reading, which is the same as language, they're identical. Therefore, we shouldn't need to teach reading. That was the argument. And it is completely wrong. Which is not to say some kids don't learn that way, but we're talking about the system level. We want all kids to learn to read. You learn to read by reading books. Oh, New Zealand. New Zealand. The hotbed of whole language it was way back then. Mem Fox writes lovely books. Should keep doing that. Good readers skim over words without attending to detail. Goodman's famous comment that we don't actually need words, we just skim over them and we go straight to meaning. Our mind is able to evoke the meaning of the author's intent without actually investigating the words. The eye movement technology studies that were done in the 90s put paid to that. It turns out that skilled readers look at pretty much every word that they see. It's just that they are so fluent at working out what the words are and having developed their capacity to read via recognition in the long term, via phonics in the short term, their capacity to do that, that gives the impression that they're skating over the top of the words. But if you look at the computer monitor that is photographing their eye movements as they read, you see that those little saccadic jumps from ensuring that letter by letter is included in the span. Some more contextual clues. We must teach readers a range of strategies, including guessing from context, which includes guessing from semantic cues and guessing from grammatical cues. We still see this 3 cueing system even in recent documents. We still keep seeing it, and it is a shocker. I don't know, somebody said, when will learning styles go away? When will the 3 cueing systems go away? Which is incidentally the title of one of my papers, which you can read on that site. Accuracy is not necessary for effective reading. I think the continuation of that quote was, if readers are not making mistakes when they read, they're not reading effectively. You've got to make mistakes. So, good spelling derives simply from the act of writing. Was another argument that as long as children are doing lots of writing activity, I don't mean teaching of writing, I mean just being asked to write things, then their spelling would automatically become closer and closer to conventional spelling. And it's simply not true. These are questions that the research has provided us with answers but which still tend to be evident in some areas. Learning styles again. And there's an address to my articles on the Nifty site there. The primary national strategy in 2006 finally got rid of the three queuing strategy. In 1998, it had called it a searchlight strategy and said, yes, that's an excellent strategy. Teach your kids to guess, as well as use phonographical information as a last resort. And they have indicated that explicit systematic phonics should be the approach to take with beginning reading. So you are looking at words and their sounds and identifying a word through a knowledge of the letter sound correspondences and the capacity to blend and segment. So in one of the direct instruction programs, an early approach to reading is, let's sound this out together. Sat. The teacher would do this a number of times with the student. Sat. Let's say it fast. Sat. So it's that sequence of sounding out, blending, and then saying it fast. Ensures that the students pay attention to the features of the word, not to the whole word. So what does phonics, we all do phonics, is the cry from many who have been criticised for offering programs that don't have enough phonics. We've always incorporated phonics. I hear that from whole language people, have done for many years. I hear it from teacher education staff. We've always done phonics. What we need to understand from the research is that phonics ain't phonics, just like oils ain't oils. It's not enough, if you want to be effective with all your students, to simply have a phonics component of a reading program and hope that the student will induce the phonic associations and thereby use phonics in the beginning stages of reading as their major approach to figuring out words. We know that the biggest single problem we have with reading in the initial phases is getting the words off the page. And I've worked with secondary students who are still in exactly the same issue. They can't get the words off the page. They look at a word and they say, I can't tell you what that is, I've never seen it before. And sometimes you might teach them a word and they might learn that word. You put an S on the end of that word and they can't read it because they've never seen it before. They're not able to use their phonic understandings to decode new words because they've never been taught systematically with a synthetic program. The research is telling us we need synthetic program. What does that mean? It means we build up from the basics. Synthesis meaning building up as opposed to analysis meaning breaking down. So the programs that have been well supported by research have been synthetic programs where they're taught the associations and what to do with those associations. An interesting side question, because blending is in itself a phonemic awareness activity, an interesting side question is how important is it that we have to do that before we introduce letters, or is it better to do both of those things together? The evidence so far suggests this may turn out to be the most efficient way to do it, but there's certainly no harm in doing these activities as an oral activity. So that's synthetic. The Americans use the word explicit instead of the British using synthetic. The Americans use implicit and the British use analytic as another form of phonics. Implicit or analytic meaning building up. So you start with words and with whole words and the teacher doesn't want to break up the words into pieces. So the teacher asks the student, can you tell me what is the common sound in those three words? And the student is meant to induce the individual sound of that letter without ever discussing what that letter might be with its sound outside of the context of a word. Implicit phonics, many students in an implicit phonics program learn their phonics quite well because they can take the extra steps themselves. But for the students who struggle, the model that is synthetic has much better results in the research so far. The second part of a program would be, do you deliver it as an incidental, let's do a bit of phonics today, or and I think today's Tuesday we'll work on the letter T, the sound of the letter T. Or do you have some sort of system that you start with a certain group of letters and you might do so because there's a particular reason. In one of the programs that I use in the RMIT clinic called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons, the letters are introduced for their facility to make easy blends. And the second criterion is you separate letters that are easily reversed. So you don't teach A, B, C, D. The B and the D often cause reversal problems with all beginning readers, or with most. So you teach D a long way away in the sequence of letters. You teach M, A and N because and there's no stop sound there. It's easy to say the sounds and say it fast. So you have some sort of system in your instruction, not just a sense of what shall we do today in our phonics lesson. It will also involve massed practice so that students learn during that day to master what it is that you are teaching them. It might be a letter sound, it might be a group of letters, and the sound for that group of letters. So they then have massed practice in which you're giving them feedback, and subsequently, in subsequent lessons, spaced practice is a critical part of your program. Part of your system is that having taught something, you don't assume that it is thereby cemented, but rather it is continued in a specific sequence for maybe the next 3 days, and then a gap of 2 days, and the next couple of days, and then it's a week apart. You gradually fade that out as it becomes clear that students have internalised and cemented what you have taught them. Incidental approaches, there are quite a few synonyms that have been bandied around for such approaches, and I've included those there. The main issue there is that everything is left, not everything, it's sometimes called minimal guidance, but so much is left to the student to develop, to practice, to master, such that those students who are our vulnerable students tend to get lost in this sort of approach. There are other students who thrive in a discovery learning approach. And there are students who, when they've mastered the sufficient of the baseline, the basal level of a skill, are then much better positioned to bootstrap themselves into making their own progress. But at the beginning stages, certainly we need to give formal instruction, not incidental instruction. Primary national strategy in 2006 suggested that direct instruction's the optimal method of teaching early reading. This is teacher-directed instruction that is formal, that is comprehensive, and which focuses on synthetic phonics initially. Decoding and comprehension, because they are separable in the simple view of reading, there are two tricks that students need. Can I get the words off the page? Can I say what's there? And secondly, can I use my language, my vocab, to ascertain what was the meaning of what was on that page? And we don't have to have activities that do both at once. In the whole language model, yes, the argument was you must not do decoding outside the context of authentic reading. It turns out that that isn't the case, that we can do it independently. More recently, for beginning reading, the US National Early Literacy Panel indicated this notion of explicit, systematic, teacher-directed approaches appear to be giving us the best results at this stage. The National Inquiry, explicit teaching of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocab and comprehension. Those were the components too of the American research in 2000, the National Research Panel, that there were 5 important areas for students to master. Now, I'm conscious of the time, and I've got to fly out of here pretty soon. The material that I've included here on different approaches and its evidence base will be on the website in the notes from this, and everything that I've talked about so far is also available on the web page that I mentioned on the National Institute for Direct Instruction website. But briefly, Whole language, I think we've seen that one in a talk earlier today. Learning styles. Perceptual motor training was quite big in the 70s. The effect, Hattie's view is that 0.4 is about the minimum that you would start to think this is worthwhile. We're seeing very poor results there. Early intervention, very strong. So partly answering that question is, if a child is struggling early, will he pick up later? Typically no. Direct instruction, a model that I favour and have written quite a bit about. The effect size, very strong. As so often, I prepare far more stuff than I have time to deliver, but I've very much enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.